Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. It's great to have so many of you join us here today to hear about how action from state and territory governments and the corporate sector are keeping ambitious climate change action within reach for Australia. I'm Rupert Posner. I'm the System Lead for Sustainable Economies here at ClimateWorks, and I'm your host for this afternoon. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and country. We pay our respect to their elders past and present, and in particular to the people of the Kulin Nation on which the ClimateWorks office in Australia is located. And I'd also like to extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today across Australia, as I know we have participants from right around the country. So today we'll be sharing with you findings from two new ClimateWorks reports, which put a spotlight on actions across the Australian economy. And these actions contribute to the global transition to net zero, which needs to be in line with limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. Now, thankfully, we're hearing the message that we need to rapidly reduce emissions and that doing so presents opportunity. And Australia certainly has a big opportunity, not only in the lead up to Glasgow next month, but also in the rest of this decade and beyond. Some of you might be familiar or recall our Decarbonisation Futures work that we released last year. The benchmarks and net zero pathways in it show that Australia can decarbonise by 2035 and still remain a prosperous, export-oriented country. But it does require us to act urgently and at scale. And I know I don't need to tell most of you this, but we do need to get a hurry on. We've got to roll out what we call mature technologies and other solutions that will drive emissions down immediately across all of our economy. Innovation is vital. We must invest more in R&D, and it's super important that we make sure our long-lived assets are built with a net zero emissions future in mind. The buildings, factories, and infrastructure we build now will still be used well beyond the time that we need to achieve net zero. So the benchmarks in decarbonisation futures are across all sectors, and we've used these to review state and territory programs and policies and to establish corporate best practice principles. And if you want to delve into them in a bit more detail, I'd encourage you to take a look. It's on our website, and there's also a reference to them or a link to them in the report. But what is clear is that Australia can chart a 1.5 degree compatible path. The momentum we can see in Australia so far this decade, often called the decade of climate action, keeps it on the table. But achieving it does require a massive step up in effort from all governments, businesses, and individuals. Where we see coordinated effort around the world that involves government policy, individual action, and investment by the private sector and others in technology and innovation and R&D, we are seeing momentous things happen. It demonstrates that innovation, cost reduction, and market take-up can happen more quickly and at a greater scale than is often expected. I mean, you just need to look at renewable energy, now cheaper than fossil fuels in most situations, and that's not even taking into account the environmental and health benefits they deliver. And another example, and I know Norway's often referred to as the poster child for electric vehicles, and you've heard it many times before, I'm sure. But I do think it's an important example. About a decade ago, it decided to support EVs. Now, I think it was after AHA pop star Morten Huckett, and some of you might remember when he was world famous pop star, he decided to drive around the country in a small EV and refused to pay tolls and parking tickets. And I think the Nine papers today have a nice story about that. But next year, Norway expects that 100% of new car sales will be EVs, achieved in about a decade since they decided to go down this path, and years earlier than expected. So there's absolutely no reason we can't achieve 100% of new car sales to be electric by 2030, especially when you consider the advances we've seen in the technology in the last decade. I mean, it would seem a cinch for us to be able to do that. As you will hear shortly, state and territory governments have made a good start, and Australia can now capitalise on this as we set our sights on more ambitious action by 2030. But of course, it's not just government. Business clearly has a huge role to play. Over the past 2 years, in fact, our net zero momentum tracker has analysed 2/3 of ASX 200 listed companies and companies that account for 2/3 of Australia's reported emissions. And through this work, we now have a much clearer picture of what's happening across all major sectors, including property, transport, retail, banking and super funds, resources, and energy generation. And we've identified what is common for company commitments to be in line with 1.5 degrees. And these are consistent with emerging global standards. Today, we'll reveal what best practice looks like for a 1.5 degree corporate climate commitment and some examples of where it's being met. And while to some extent today we're celebrating successes and we do want to share optimism, there is no doubt that much more needs to be done from everyone, and not just action, swift action. Our delays up until now means we need to do more and we need to do it more quickly. Today, we'll detail the leading policies and programs in Australia, how far they get us and what still needs to happen, including some of the things that are getting in the way. You'll hear from 3 of my ClimateWorks colleagues, Simon Graham, a senior analyst who will present our state and territory findings. Wei Sue is our system lead for sustainable corporates. She'll give you the very first look at our latest net zero momentum tracker assessment report. And our senior analyst, Coral Bravo, will provide highlights of those companies with the strongest climate action commitments and strategies when measured against our 2030 benchmarks. And of course, you'll have the opportunity to ask our speakers questions once everybody has presented. So if you do have a question, please jot it down in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We've all been doing these for a long time, so I'm sure you're familiar with that process. Anyway, we will try to get to as many of them as we can. So we'll kick off now, and I'd like to welcome Simon Graham. Now, Simon's the brains behind our States and Territories report. He's spent many months benchmarking state and territory policy against our decarbonisation futures. What he doesn't know about state government policy on this, it's not worth knowing. Anyway, take it away, Simon.
Thanks, Rupert, and thanks everyone who's joined in to listen today. I'm going to run through the main findings of our report on state and territory climate action so far this decade. I'll talk through where states and territories are currently at in terms of climate policies and the shift in momentum that we've seen over the past 18 months. But I'll also talk about what more needs to be done this decade. A decade the science shows needs to be one of transformational action if we are to keep global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees or even below 2. So let's look first at Australian state and territory net zero targets. As of July of 2020, all states and territories have set a target for net zero emissions. For most, this is by 2050, with the ACT targeting net zero by 2045, and Tasmania announcing just yesterday that they'll legislate a target of net zero by 2030. Overall, these commitments cover all emissions produced within Australia's borders. And so in doing so, they represent a crucial step of serious coordinated action on climate in Australia. But there's much more to do. While net zero by 2050 is aligned to 2-degree scenarios modelled by ClimateWorks as part of our decarbonisation futures work, achieving a 1.5 degree pathway means meeting net zero Australia-wide much earlier, as early as the mid-2030s. So there's substantial room and need for an increase in overall ambition. What our decarbonisation futures modelling also shows us is that to be on track for the Paris goals, significant changes need to occur this decade. In our scenarios aligned to 2 and 1.5 degrees of warming, the renewable share of electricity, for example, reaches over 70% by 2030. Electric vehicles represent 3 in 4 new cars sold in the 1.5 degree scenario by 2030. And there's various other benchmarks that you can see there on screen. I'll draw your attention to the fact that overall emissions decrease from 2005 levels, which is the baseline year used by most states and territories, by 48 to 53% for the 2 degree scenario this decade, and 74% in the 1.5 degree scenario. So keeping those figures in mind, what are states and territories targeting by 2030? Around the country, we see a wide range of interim targets. As mentioned, Tasmania is targeting net zero by 2030. Victoria is targeting 45 to 50% reduction. New South Wales and South Australia are targeting 50%. ACT is targeting 65 to 75%. Queensland's targeting 30%. And Northern Territory and Western Australia have yet to set interim targets, but very well could do so in the next year. Most importantly, if we combine these targets with the relative shares of emissions, of Australia's emissions for these states and territories, and also combine it with feasible pathways for Northern Territory and WA, we estimate there's a de facto Australia-wide emissions target of approximately 37 to 42% reduction on 2005 levels by 2030. Now, this is short of what's needed. Remember, our modelling shows roughly 50% reduction in the 2 degree scenarios and 74% in the 1.5. But 37 to 42% is still substantially higher than the current 26 to 28% target at the federal level. So there is ample opportunity to increase that target, as well as for states and territories to up their interim targets so Australia can be aligned to Paris. Now, targets are one thing, they're a key step, but the real action, real change happens when targets are implemented through actions in key sectors of the economy. And what I'll do now is run through some of the key highlights of this we're seeing across states and territories. First of all, let's look at electricity. Here we see state and territory renewable targets aggregating to an approximate 55% renewable energy target Australia-wide by 2030. And governments are taking substantial action to ensure that implementation. If we look at specific states and territories, Tasmania and the ACT are leading here, achieving 100% renewables already. South Australia is also targeting 100% by 2030. And multiple states and territories, including the big 3 East Coast states, are exploring renewable energy zones, which are like modern day power plants, where renewable generation assets are clustered together with high voltage transmission, as well as storage. Overall, renewable electricity projects in the pipeline already equate to over 10,000 megawatts of new generation and about 1,400 megawatts of storage. But remember, our scenarios show over 70% of electricity is renewably generated by 2030. So what more needs to be done? Well, many states and territories have room to up their renewable targets and the implementation plans associated with them. And we don't only need increased renewable share of electricity, but increased capacity. We expect much of the economy to be electrified over this decade, and that's going to increase demand. To balance this out, there's also a lot of space for improved energy efficiency to do more with the electricity that we already have. If we move on to transport now, here is where we've seen a real increase in momentum over the past 18 months. New South Wales and Victoria, the 2 most populated states, are targeting 50% of new car sales being electric by 2030. And based on their share of cars in Australia, this translates to a roughly 30% of new cars sold being electric Australia-wide by that date. And it's not just these two. The rest of the country are introducing policies to drive uptake as well, offering subsidies, waiving stamp duty, and showing leadership by transitioning government fleets. But it's important when we think about transport to not just think about electric cars. Public transport is also really important when we see states and territories looking at decarbonising these modes, and there's a couple of examples of that on screen. And also looking at increasing the overall share of public and active transport, which is quite essential for net zero transport. In terms of what more needs to be done, there's a lot. We need higher EV targets across the country and the implementation plans to make that happen. We need an increased emphasis on active and public transport, as well as coordinated attention to freight transport, a source of emissions that's higher in many states and territories than passenger transport, and for which the solutions and the policies are really only just emerging. If we go now to buildings, and here we're talking about both residential and commercial. Australia is currently leading the world on rooftop solar per person, and states and territories are working on balancing this side of the equation with addressing energy efficiency and beginning to tackle natural gas use, which is a substantial source of emissions. Multiple states and territories have retailer energy efficiency schemes, which require the big energy retailers to meet targets by funding energy efficiency upgrades for its customers. And all states and territories have at least one policy or program directly funding energy efficiency efforts. The ACT is leading the way overall, however, by not only looking at incentives for energy efficiency, but also working on minimum standards for rentals, as well as targeting a full phase out of fossil fuel gas use by 2045. In terms of what more needs to be done, policies across the country are needed to support the phase out of fossil fuel gas use in buildings, something that occurs in our modelling by 2040. We also need transformational large-scale programs to roll out energy efficiency improvements and electrification in both new and existing buildings, as well as stringent minimum standards to set a higher floor. If we look now at industry, since the start of the decade, states and territories have begun to give attention to this, to recognise its importance in the net zero task. The private sector has done this as well. The largest program at the state level that we've seen in this space is New South Wales's $750 million net zero industry and innovation program, which is targeting both high emitting industries as well as establishing new low carbon industries and clean tech innovation. In terms of new low carbon industries, we're seeing action on this all around the country. And the most notable industry that I'm sure you've seen in the news quite a lot lately is green hydrogen. All states and territories are going down this path, and we've seen things like Queensland's $2 billion Renewable Energy and Hydrogen Jobs Fund, and New South Wales's announcement this week of $3 billion of funding for green hydrogen. It's still early days to see what sort of possibilities this is going to unlock for industry more broadly. But it's important that we see all in action, not just on hydrogen. States and territories need to develop solutions and implement them for addressing rising fugitive emissions, as well as chemical process emissions. And like in buildings, we need increased investment in energy efficiency and electrification in industry. And there's also an opportunity and a need for stricter regulation on industrial developments to ensure what is built and what is approved is done so with the net zero emissions future in mind. And finally, we have agriculture, land use, and forestry. Agriculture, like industry, is a hard to abate sector, and many of the solutions for key emission sources like methane from livestock are still emerging and in demonstration phases. But there is early promising action. Western Australia is intending to develop a carbon neutral agriculture scheme. Victoria is piloting on-farm emissions reduction action plans. and South Australia is supporting the development of anti-methane seaweed production. These policies and others like them need to be taken from demonstration to at-scale deployment over the coming years. And if we talk about land use, multiple states and territories are introducing carbon farming initiatives. The Queensland's Land Restoration Fund is a notable example here, supporting carbon farming as well as environmental, socio-economic and First Nations co-benefits. And our modelling shows that substantial nature-based carbon sequestration through things like carbon farming is needed to achieve Paris-aligned pathways. And there's work to do to develop these efforts at scale, but while also balancing emissions goals with other land use requirements like food and biodiversity, and also taking into consideration our land's vulnerability to potential impacts of climate change like bushfires. So that's a summary of what we're seeing at the sectoral level across states and territories. And there's much more detail on all those points in the report itself. I'll make one more point before I wrap up, which is that the Paris Agreement is going to require action on all fronts, especially in terms of policy. And what we see is that state and territory policy, we don't only need ambitious sectoral action, but the integration of emissions goals into the foundational policies that have impacts across the economy. So here we're talking about things like infrastructure and planning, procurement, trade, finance. We see not integrating emissions goals into these policies might stop those goals from being achieved. Fortunately, we are seeing the early stages of mainstreaming climate goals across government. The ACT, for example, is implementing a social cost of carbon to be factored into government project decisions. South Australia's infrastructure project guidelines includes emissions requirements, and Tasmania's procurement guidelines are aligned to climate change objectives. And we hope to see much more of this sort of policy making over the coming years. In summary, we've seen a real shift in the momentum on climate action at the state and territory level since the start of the decade. Taking action on climate change has also become much less of a partisan issue in Australia at the state and territory level. Governments from across the political spectrum are starting to really move on climate policy. But as Rupert said earlier, there's much more work to do, and the window for keeping global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees is narrowing. We need action in every state and every sector to be scaled up and accelerated. And we know that this is what the people of Australia want. The Climate of the Nation survey that the Australian Institute released today shows that the overwhelming majority of Australians support Paris-aligned targets and the actions to implement them. 1.5 degrees is possible, but only if states and territories, as well as all other levels of government, businesses and individuals as well, keep up the momentum and capitalise on it and go all in on climate action this decade. I'll hand back over to Rupert now and look forward to answering any questions on any of that at the end.
Great, thanks very much, Simon, really appreciate that. And I think it's fair to say that the interest we've already received for this work shows that not just here in Australia, but also internationally, that there is a real interest in the action that states and territories are taking. And obviously Glasgow next month is an important immediate focus, but after it, as we accelerate action, learning from others will be super important. And I can see a few people have joined during that presentation. Thank you for being with us for the launch of new ClimateWorks insights into actions of state and territory governments. We're now going to hear about Australia's corporate sector and how it's going against ambitious 2030 emission reduction targets. And just in case you forgot, and I can't imagine you did, the goal is to limit global temperatures to 1.5 degrees, which means deep cuts this decade. We're having a look at how and why Australia should be confident it can achieve overall cuts of 75% by 2030. And I'm Rupert Posner. Now remember, if you've got a question for our speakers, please jot it down in the Q&A section on your screen and we will get to them after our next presentation. I will now introduce Wei Sue, who's giving you the very first look at our corporate best practice principles for net zero commitments, which we're releasing publicly on Monday. So over to you, Wei.
Thank you, Rupert. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to share with you today the latest findings from our Net Zero Momentum Tracker initiative in the form of our new report titled Corporate Action for 1.5 Degrees, Best Practice for Australian Company Net Zero Commitments. The Net Zero Momentum Tracker is an initiative by ClimateWorks and Monash Sustainable Development Institute that assessed 158 corporate commitments over the last 2 years, covering the property, transport, retail, resources, energy, banking, and superannuation sectors. This was originally intended to centrally track net zero commitments in Australia to demonstrate momentum and encourage more commitments across the corporate sector. Corporates are important because they are responsible for the majority of emissions in Australia and have a key role to play in addressing these. Emissions reported through the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Scheme, which covers only corporates that meet certain reporting thresholds, already account for 78% of Australia's national emissions. The good news is, since we first started the Net Zero Momentum Tracker, we've seen a proliferation of net zero commitments in corporate Australia. However, not all commitments are equal. In fact, most commitments are not in line with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. Recent studies, including the IPCC 6th Assessment Report and the latest United Nations report, demonstrate the importance and urgency of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. Many scientists and institutions now agree that climate action towards 1.5 degrees is imperative. Fortunately, ClimateWorks' Decarbonisation Futures report, which sets out 3 net zero pathways for Australia through detailed modelling, shows that Australia can reduce our emissions in line with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees through reaching net zero emissions by 2035. This 1.5 degree scenario provides the benchmark for our latest analysis of company commitments. Our latest report builds on the assessments we've done in the last 2 years and collates these learnings in the form of 4 best practice principles that can be consistently applied to corporate climate commitments. The analysis was based on public information that has also been verified by companies for accuracy. This update is based on a sample of 30 companies that were selected to highlight and illustrate ambition and action by corporate Australia today. My colleague Coral will take you through the details of the 4 principles that we've established, but I'll share some key takeaways from the analysis we've done in applying these principles to the sample of companies we looked at. Firstly, we found that commitments made by companies, in particular interim or medium-term commitments, tend to underestimate the steep trajectory and significant change that is required, in particular from 2025 onwards, when the change is needed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. We also found that the vast majority of commitments focus only on reducing operational emissions, which, as we know, is only a small or narrow scope of emissions for many businesses. In fact, the most material emissions for a company is often those that a business can influence along its value chain or its customer and financed emissions. There's also a lack of demonstrable actions that are being reported to back up commitments that companies have made. In reviewing publicly available company reports, it was difficult to find measurable evidence of actions that companies are undertaking today to reduce their emissions. The review undertaken also showed a huge variety and nature of commitments, many of which lack clarity around the scope of emissions covered, the baseline year or emissions levels commitments are made against, and the different ways that are used to describe these commitments, which leads me to my final point. Carbon neutrality and net zero are often used interchangeably in many cases, but it's important to remember that they're not the same, especially if carbon neutrality refers to a heavy reliance on carbon offsets. Due to constraints with land availability or food production, just to name a couple, offsets should be reserved for residual emissions that cannot be addressed through available technologies, and offsets alone cannot be considered a sustainable path towards net zero emissions.
Thanks very much, Wei. And if you want to have a look at the more than 150 company assessments we've produced over the past 2 years, you can do that by heading to the ClimateWorks website. But let's get straight into more detail and examples of Australian companies that are starting to align to at least some of the best practice principles. So I'd like to pass to Coral Bravo. Thanks, Coral.
Thank you, Rupert. Well, as Wei was mentioning earlier, we are seeing momentum happening and more companies are setting decarbonisation commitments. So it's really important for corporates to get these commitments right. And what do I mean by right? Well, from our experience working for the past 2 years in the Net Zero Momentum Tracker initiative, we've learned that 4 principles demonstrate best practice in creating net zero commitments that are in line with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. The first one is having a long-term net zero commitment by or before 2050. Second one, having at least one medium-term target that is appropriate and ambitious. These commitments should address operational, value chain, customer, and finance emissions. And they should be supported by tangible near-term actions. I'll now explain in detail each of these principles. First of all, companies must set net zero targets in line with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This principle recognizes that, as some of you already know, the 1.5 degrees trajectory varies across sectors. Therefore, corporate commitments must be in line with the appropriate trajectory based on the sector to which the company belongs. Another important aspect of this principle is understanding that setting long-term commitments requires undertaking a backcasting approach, which means that corporates start with a clear long-term goal and work backwards to define the pathway to achieve it. To meet the long-term targets, as Wei was saying, offsets must only be used for unavoidable emissions. In our assessment of the 30 companies, we use ClimateWorks Decarbonisation Futures 1.5 degree scenario to assess the alignment of corporate long-term commitments. And an example of an Australian organization meeting this principle is the property company Analyst, which has committed to achieving net zero operational emissions by 2025 and absolute net zero for all emissions by 2040. Setting a long-term commitment is just one piece of the puzzle. Commitments must also include at least one interim or medium-term target. Setting and regularly updating these targets will help ensure companies' decarbonization trajectories are and remain on track to meet their long-term commitments. As with the first principle, medium-term targets must be in line with a 1.5 degree trajectory appropriate for the sector where the company operates in. During the assessment of the 30 companies, we evaluated the medium-term commitments using Decarbonisation Futures 1.5 degree trajectory, and we identified some examples of organizations meeting this principle, including Dexus and Coles. Both have set medium-term targets for their operational emissions, and Dexus is also covering value chain emissions. The third principle refers to the emissions covered by the commitment set. Companies' net zero and medium-term targets generally address their operational emissions, but leave out value chain emissions, which, as Wei mentioned, for most sectors are the most significant source of emissions. Considering companies control who they purchase from and that they often have some influence over their customers, corporate emission reduction commitments and actions should reflect this and address the emissions generated across the value chain of the goods and services that they purchase and sell. Two examples of companies meeting this principle are Dexus, with targets for operational as well as supplier and tenant emissions, and Forestry, which has set targets for its entire value chain and operations. Now, the fourth principle refers to the ambitious near-term actions, supporting the long and medium-term commitments. These actions can be classified into two categories. First one is the activities that directly lead to a reduction in emissions and help achieve set commitments. And the second one are the enabling activities which do not directly reduce emissions, but they create a supportive environment to implement ambitious emission reduction measures across the company's operations and value chain, ensuring that these remain a priority well into the future. Now, the activities resulting in a reduction of emissions can be classified under 4 areas. The first one, energy efficiency. So referring to companies reducing their energy waste, improving their energy productivity, and shifting away from energy-intensive products and services. The second pillar is implementing renewable electricity, recognizing that now companies can switch to 100% renewable electricity. The third pillar requires companies to move away from fossil fuels to zero or near zero emissions alternatives. And the last pillar refers to companies reducing non-energy emissions. This pillar also considers offsets, which should only be used when the previous 3 types of activities are not feasible. Now, the activities enabling the implementation of these 4 pillars of action include corporates getting involved in alliances, networks, or engagement activities, also setting up governance and internal practices, for example, including accountability, remuneration, and incentive structures. Another supporting action is establishing and implementing climate strategies and transition plans, which are embedded within the organizational culture and values. Companies should also engage with key players across their value chain, including working with their suppliers and supporting customers by providing products that are net zero aligned. And finally, experimentation, learning, and investment in research is also really important. This includes investments in innovation and technology to facilitate decarbonization where solutions do not currently exist. So what's next? Well, from our analysis, we found that out of the 30 companies assessed, Dexus and Forestry are the only ones currently meeting all 4 principles. So it is evident that while momentum towards net zero commitments is increasing, corporate climate action must be more ambitious. Companies must meet all 4 principles to reach the best practice benchmark and support the whole of economy decarbonization trajectory in line with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. ClimateWorks is well placed to support Australian companies to better understand what best climate practice looks like. And in fact, a report that we'll be publishing next week is part of our commitment to support Australia's corporate sector to attain global best practice for climate action. And that's all from me, thank you. And I'll hand over back to Rupert.
Great, thank you very much for that, Coral. Well, as we've heard, there's much more to do, not just with corporate action, but state and territories too, but that we can harness the momentum that's there to help us achieve what's needed. Now it's time for your questions and our speakers to try and answer some of them. We've had quite a lot coming through and you can still add them in the Q&A section. There've been a couple of questions which I think might be worth touching on first, which was around why does ClimateWorks 1.5 degree scenario talk about Australia achieving net zero by 2035? Aren't we hearing that global emissions need to be by 2050? So why is there the difference? Simon, I can see you nodding there. So maybe you might want to shed a bit of light on explaining where these different years come from.
Yeah, sure, Rupert, and thanks for the question. So in terms of the global scene, we see net zero before 2050 being roughly aligned to 1.5 degrees of warming. But what has been recognised in the international negotiations is that for developing countries, their emissions are likely to peak later than ours. And so their timeline is different to developed countries like Australia. And so the relevant date for Australia is more in the line with 2035. And it does get a bit complicated with the different dates. And then there's also the fact of carbon budgets. So it's not just about when you get to net zero, but it's about your trajectory to getting there as well. And so that's what our modelling tries to take into consideration too.
Thanks, Simon. And Coral or Wei, looking at the corporate sector, again, there's all this talk about 2050. Is the corporate sector understanding that actually here we need to achieve emission reductions well before that?
Yeah, so we looking at the sample of 30 companies that we selected, and we did look at the 30 companies with a view of selecting those that are likely to have some of the more a higher profile climate commitments based on the 2 years of analysis that we've done before this. And in the analysis that we've done, in comparing it against the sectoral trajectories from our decarbonisation futures 1.5 degree scenarios, most companies, to the extent that they have made an interim commitment, were found to not align with the trajectory and the reductions that are required in the sectors that they are operating in order for Australia to reduce its emissions in line with a 1.5 degree scenario. So it is, and in some cases where we have looked at it, we have found that some of the interim targets were in line with a 2 degree scenario, but not quite enough for 1.5.
Right, thank you very much for that, Wei. And we've got a question here about the proportion of emissions by different sectors. And I know, Simon, you've looked at the different sectors. How does the action in those sectors look? You know, which areas are we doing well in? Where are the areas where there's more to be done?
Yeah, so in terms of relative share of emissions by sector, it very much depends based on state and territory. For example, industry, say in Victoria or ACT is a smaller share than it is in some other states and things like that. In terms of where we're looking at things, so what our decarbonisation futures modelling showed is that some sectors, and a big sector like electricity is a large source of emissions, but the solutions to it are very mature, and so we can get to zero in those sectors pretty quickly. The ones that we call harder to abate sectors, which is where the solutions aren't as formed yet, and we're not seeing as much action, are things like industry and agriculture. So there's more work to do there to not just roll out the solutions, but to develop them and work out how to address it.
Thank you for that, Simon. There's a question here that was just in front of my screen, but it's just popped away, but I think I've got a copy of it here. A question from Cindy for Wei here about how equipped the private sector organisations are to quantify their energy transition in risk in terms of financial terms and what it means for them. So perhaps you could think.
Thanks for the question, Cindy. So in terms of quantifying the risks in financial terms relating to not just transition risk, but climate risk in general, recognising that there is the physical impact and physical risks that we need to consider in addition to transition risks. I would say that the private sector, yes, is fast scaling that learning curve with the introduction of things like the TCFD or the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosure, and in various markets, increasingly so, it's gaining a lot of attention, which has actually translated into a lot of the larger corporates actually upskilling and building the capability to understand and quantify both physical and transition risks in financial terms. However, in saying that, possibly one of the reasons why we are still seeing a very heavy or strong focus on operational emissions is this lack of recognition of the sort of the breadth of physical and transition risks and where material emissions influence and sources can be. And so in some cases, it's scope 3, which can relate to your customers' emissions, or it can relate to your suppliers' emissions, but it can also relate to financed or investment emissions in the case of financial institutions. So it is possibly those secondary or tertiary tiers of emissions that are a little less, that have less attention to date, but it's growing.
That relates a little bit to a question we've got here from Natalie about mining companies, and obviously lots of talk in Australia, very topical, about the mining sector, and interested in both perspectives. Simon, how state governments are starting to address this issue of particularly the energy intensive and industry sector and also the corporate team, what you're seeing from that point of view. Maybe Simon, if you want to kick off first.
Yeah, sure, Rupert. And that's a good question, very timely. So in terms of state and territory action here, I mean, I just said in my last response that industry is one of the harder to abate sectors and emerging in terms of action there. We're seeing a few different things from a regulation standpoint. We're seeing, for example, WA and Northern Territory introducing regulation on new industrial developments and things like mines, and so that has an impact on emissions. And then a whole lot of different early demonstration projects looking about how to use renewable electricity in mines, electric vehicles and things like that, and processes. So still quite early days, but states and territories are tackling it from a few different directions.
Wei, did you want to join or Corral on that point?
Yeah, so from a private sector perspective, I guess, in addition to needing to get states and territories and getting regulation lined up, with the harder to abate sectors, of which, mining companies certainly are in, there is also a chicken and egg issue around working across their supply chains in order to, for example, if a customer wanted green steel, how could they justify that they'll need performance or demonstration or evidence to show that the performance of that steel is equivalent to traditional or conventional methods of producing them. So in order to resolve these, joining alliances and networks such as the ones that we have here, that we convene here at ClimateWorks, being the Australian Energy Industry Transitions Initiative, is a good example of ways to help mining companies and other heavy industry actors to come together and work on the issues together.
Thank you for that, Wei. And I can see a question from Alan Pears here, who is a guru in this space. So wonderful to see that you've joined us today. And look, a cheeky but interesting point there about, money being spent on consultants to do lots of inventories, and wouldn't it be easier just to overestimate a little bit and spend the money on doing something? I think that's probably more of a comment and an interesting one. There is certainly a lot of people working in this space, which is certainly positive. And you're right, what's more important is getting on and doing things. There's another question here, and it is about the net zero momentum tracker work that's been done. And, there's lots of reports that come out. We've just done one now. Do they gain any traction? Does anybody actually change any of their behaviour as a result of what's going out? So I'd be interested to get some response on that.
Yes, I can answer that one. Can you hear me okay? My audio working, great. Yeah, so we've had positive comments on every time that we've released a report, and it's good to see that there's interest from companies to understand a bit more what are the different options to decarbonize, and which activities can they undertake to reduce emissions a bit further, and they're interested in knowing, okay, what other companies maybe are doing and taking some of that into their own operations. We've seen sometimes ClimateWorks, our work, specifically the Net Zero Momentum Tracker reports, are being quoted in some minutes, so companies are having their internal meetings and discussing the findings from our reports and noting how those can be used internally. So that's also something positive. And companies have reached out to us directly, asking us for a bit more information of what we've found and what else can be done in the specific sector that they operate in.
Right, thank you for that, Corral. And there were a few questions about offsetting. And, it's a good question. Certainly years ago, the idea was you just offset things, and many companies, News Corporation went carbon neutral a decade ago. And a lot of that was through offsetting. But so it'd be interesting just to get your sense from the decarbonisation futures, but where does that fit in there? Because we do talk about net zero, which means that there will still be some emissions, but how much are we talking about, and what should that be focused on?
Yeah, it's a great question, and again, timely. There's a lot of conversation around the idea of net zero and the role of offsets. So, from a national level in our modelling, we see that, especially in the 1.5 degree scenarios, we need a lot of negative emissions as well, and this mainly comes from the land use change and forestry space. So on a national level, you can think of this as offsetting, so it's negative emissions that balance out some positive emissions also in the economy. In terms of offsets on, say, a business level, That's a slightly different story. But I think the important thing we're seeing is that there's quite a number of sectors like electricity and buildings where we can get to not net zero emissions, but zero emissions. And so offsets are not needed there. And they really, the idea of balancing out with negative emissions should only be for those emission sources that there just isn't any feasible way to do it in the near term. And we would expect if there was an offset market that by the price of it, that will only go to those businesses and companies and processes that really don't have any other solution, because it would be cheaper for others just to not emit in the first place. So that's a bit about what's going on.
Great, thank you very much for that, Simon. And I think a timely question to wrap up on, because we've run a little bit over time. I know there've been a whole heap of questions and we really do appreciate them. Thank you all for being with us today. But before we sign off, a reminder where you can access these reports. You'll receive an email from us with a recording of today's presentation and discussion, and including our corporate climate action for 1.5 degrees report on Monday. Even though you've seen a little bit of that early, you can already access the State and Territory Climate Action Report on our website, which I believe is in the chat. And of course, if you enjoyed this, please tune into our next webinar, which will be taking place on Tuesday, the 26th of October. That event is part of our ongoing briefing room series and is about chasing Southeast Asia's green future. I know that one's going to be really interesting. It's going to be hosted by ClimateWorks Chair, John Thwaites. I'm sure many are familiar with him. There is also more information about that in the chat, I believe. But before we go, I'd like to say thank you to our speakers, our production team, and our report authors, and make special mention to our philanthropic supporters and program partners. We wouldn't be able to do all this without your support. So thank you very much. We do really value our partnerships and working together. Thank you for your interest. My name's Rupert Posner. See you next time.